The goal of this exercise is to make it possible to click on the campsites listed in the directory and have the campsite information come up at the bottom of the screen as you see here, using the card component from React Native Elements. To get started, open VS Code to your project folder and create a new file in the components folder called campsiteinfo-component.js. We'll import React as usual, then the text and view components from React Native, and the card component from React Native Elements. Next, let's write the campsite info component first as a functional component that receives props. Then, before anything else, I'll make sure to export it here as the default so I don't forget later. Back in the campsite info component, from its props, we're going to pull out a campsite object and send it to another component we'll call render campsite, just like that. And that's all this component will do for now, so we'll just return this and that's it. We'll come back and add more to campsite info component in a later exercise. And now we need to make the render campsite component. And right now, from the props object that it receives, we're only going to use the property of the campsite object so we can destructure it right here in the parameter list. Then we'll make sure that this campsite object is not null or undefined, and we can do that by just checking it with an if statement, which would return false in those cases. And if it holds a truthy value, then we'll do what's inside this if block. And what we want to do in that case is return a card. This card component from React Native Elements lets us use a feature title prop, and we'll set that to the campsite name. Then an image, and we'll set that the same way we did with the avatar in the directory component, with the require function and then the path to the image, which again, we'll just hardcode here for now, and we'll come back to this later. Then we'll use the text component from React Native here, and we'll give it a style prop of margin 10. And since this is an object, it needs double curly braces inside JSX. And remember, this looks like CSS, but it's not. It's similar to CSS, but it's really JavaScript. And inside the text component's start and end tags, we'll put the campsite description. Then after we end the if block, we'll need to make sure that we add a return for the falsy case for if we didn't enter the if block, because we always have to return something from a component. So if we did not get a valid campsite object, we will return here an empty view component. That's it for the campsite info component. Next, we need to update the main and directory components to support this new component. Let's start with main. Here, our goal is to render the campsite info component to the view below the directory component whenever one of the campsites listed in the directory is clicked. We'll start by importing campsite info, and we'll be using the view component from React Native as well. Next, we'll need to reserve a space in the local state of main component where we'll keep track of which campsite has been selected so we know which one to tell the campsite info component to display. So we'll initialize a selected campsite property to null. And we're also going to need an event handler that will update this selected campsite property in our state whenever a campsite is selected. We'll set that up here as onCampsiteSelect, passing in the campsite ID. Then we'll use this.setState to update the state. Remember, this is just like what we did in the React course before we moved all of our state to being managed by Redux. In our setup here, the state is being managed just by the React Native components instead of Redux. Down here, inside the render and return, now we're going to be returning the campsite info component as well as the directory component. But just like in React, we can't return two components at the top level. We can only return one. So we'll set up a view component that will wrap around them both. And let's give it a layout style prop of flex1, which makes this a flexible component of normal size. There are links in the additional resources section if you're curious about how flex works in React Native. Then make sure to set up the end tag for view. And let's not forget to close the parentheses for the return statement as well. For the directory component, let me just put each prop in its own line so it's easier to read, and then we'll set up a second prop here that we'll call onPress. And we'll pass it an arrow function that takes a campsite ID as a parameter and contains the onCampsiteSelect event handler inside the function body. So here, what we're doing is, we're not calling the this.onCampsiteSelect method. We're just passing the method to the directory component so that it's available to be triggered from there. We'll add that part in a moment. Then the last thing that we need to do inside the main component is set up the campsite info component here to be rendered, and we'll pass it a prop of campsite. For the content of this prop, what we want to do is pass it an entire campsite object with a name, image, description, and everything. So we can't just pass it the selected campsite property because all that contains is the campsite ID, not the entire campsite object. So what we can do is take the entire array of campsite objects that we have in the state, then filter it, and look for a matching campsite ID. I'm just going to move this to the next line to make it easier for you to read. Then, as you know, filter always returns an array, so we'll grab the first item in that array at index 0. Then that should contain the campsite object that corresponds to the campsite ID stored in selected campsite. That concludes what we need to do in the main component, so then we just have one more thing to do in the directory component. In the directory component, we just need to add one prop to the list item component. The list item component comes with its own built-in onPress prop. So when this component is pressed on a mobile device, the function that you give it here will automatically fire. So we'll use that to trigger our onCampsiteSelect event handler that we passed in via props. And remember, we gave that prop the name onPress as well. And in here, we have access to the ID of the press campsite. So we can give that value to the onCampsiteSelect event handler here. Then it'll be able to update the selected campsite property in the main component with this ID. At this point, your mobile app should be working as you saw in the beginning of this exercise. If you click on any of the directory listings, the campsite info component should appear at the bottom. Ensure that your app is working in this way in your emulator or mobile device before you continue. If you get strange errors and you've double-checked your code and it all looks correct to you, then remember you may need to reload the app in your emulator or device, or it might help to restart your emulator or restart Expo completely. When you're finished, remember to make a commit if you're using Git.